Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. Today is June 9th, 2025. We're seeing oil prices at $65 a barrel. My name is Trisha Curtis. I am the CEO of PetroNerds and the host of the PetroNerds podcast. You'll see this awesome shirt I'm sporting today. This is episode 133 of the PetroNerds podcast. I'm in my truck right now because I'm actually in Newcastle, Wyoming. I am actually right in front of the Wyoming refining company. I'm right in front of the Newcastle refinery. So in Newcastle, Wyoming today, the weather is nice. The sun is shining. It's a little windy. June 9th, 2025, we're sitting at $65 a barrel. So there's a lot to catch you up on in this very short introduction to this podcast. Now, the podcast that you're going to hear today is the talk and that I gave, or the fireside chat I had at the Colorado School of Mines on April 1st, 2025. So this is the day before Tariff Day. And this is a really awesome conversation and chat that I had with Morgan Bazilian. He's the director of the Payne Institute at the Colorado School of Mines. So I'm a fellow with them. I was honored to be invited to the school to talk to students and faculty as well. So it was a really fun conversation and a really deep dive in inflation, China, oil prices, energy, sort of the gauntlet. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, of some of the stuff that you're going to hear. But I want to lead into this podcast, and I apologize to listeners. I had some technical difficulties. I'm up on the road, obviously visiting my folks in Newcastle, Wyoming, and I now have a podcast mic, and so hopefully this is recording all right. But today, I'm really, really impressed with the footing that we've seen in oil prices, largely because we saw so much, I think, overselling. So at $65 a barrel, you're getting into better reflection of supply and demand realities. Now, partly that is because we were way oversold. So when we were in the high 50s, and every time we've had an OPEC meeting, and we oversell. What happened in this previous OPEC meeting? So on April 2nd, we had an OPEC meeting of increasing output. Prices dropped. On May 3rd, we had the same meeting. Prices dropped. And so the next Monday, prices went crazy. I've talked about this in previous podcasts. And then within 48 hours, prices came back up. Now, what happened in this last meeting at the beginning of June, just a week ago, was that OPEC said, hey, we are actually going to increase output in July, but they didn't increase it in June. And so, one, that's a bit of a reprieve, so it's not a month over month. But there were some questions. Of who was advocating for this. And obviously, it's the Saudis advocating for the supply increase because it's the Saudis taking their barrels back. Their voluntary cut that they gave to the market a couple years ago, that lollipop cut of 1 million barrels a day that's held all the fabric and the glue of OPEC together, is all Saudi Arabia. And so the Saudis are looking at this market saying, hey, we think that Trump is going to sanction Iranian crude. We think that, they potentially probably think that Russian crude has to be sanctioned, and they want their barrels to be in place. And they also just want to take back market share. So regardless of whether or not those barrels get sanctioned and barrels come off, the Saudis want their barrels on the market, and they want to take back market share. And they do want to they do want to push back on cheaters within OPEC, or folks that are increasing output. And Kazakhstan has come out and said, hey, we're going to increase output anyway because we're going to keep increasing it, and actually till prices come up. So you got to realize that's the logic of OPEC producers, some especially smaller guys, is that they're going to offset losses in price by increasing output. And so I think it's important for folks in the shale patch to appreciate that unless you see really significant material declines in output in the U.S., when you hear Paul Sankey on CNBC talking about this and saying, this was over a month ago, but when he said, hey, the U.S., when the letter from Diamondback came out and they said the U.S. needs to drop 2 million barrels a day of output, well, that's a lot of production, folks. That's 2 million barrels a day output drop is a significant amount for the U.S. And you would have to really have significantly lower oil prices to really materially drop all the rigs, all the completions that we're bringing on month over month to make that happen. I've been working on a forecast of actually looking at all the basins in the U.S. and total U.S. production for oil and natural gas and BOE, and seeing what it would take to actually really drop production. And what's impressive is that, you can cut the wells in half that we're adding each month. You could cut that in half, and it would take you a while to actually decline production. I mean, you decline production significantly, but it would take you to 2030 if you took the wells in half to actually get to 10 million barrels a day. So I think it's really impressive in terms of, that we have to appreciate the level of activity that we have, the amount of wells that we're bringing on each month. We would have to really, really cut that back to significantly lower output, and that would have to be sustained. So with that, timestamping this intro, $65 a barrel. I think this is important because within this talk you're going to hear with Morgan Bazilian, I say, we're talking about Trump, we're talking about Biden, we're talking about politics, and we're talking about what does the industry want for prices. And I say, 65 would be great. Well, we're at it today. So WTI is $65.32. Brent is 67.13. So kind of impressive when we see that Brent WTI spread really narrowing. We tend to see it obviously when WTI goes up or when prices go up, and that's really showing you that there's a lot of trading back on WTI, that folks are removing their shorts, or they're changing their covering, or there's lots of volatility in this trade. And the trade right now is China and the US talks right now in London, which I'll talk about momentarily, as well as Iran and Russia. So if you want to know the big reasons why oil prices are going up, it's China, it's Russia, and it's Iran. Those are not necessarily the right reasons you want oil prices to go up. And I'll walk you through those in just a minute. So Henry Hub, we're looking at $3.61. So we really do need to see natural gas prices more into that $4 range. But I think we obviously need to see significantly more natural gas exports, and we need to see more natural gas pulled into the power generation sector. But 361 on Henry Hub, we're looking at Dutch TTF at just under $12 at $11.94 for European natural gas prices. And we are looking at the 10-year yield at just under 4.5%. So in the last several weeks, we've had incredible volatility on the 10-year yield and just yields in general. I've talked about this a little bit in previous podcasts, but it's been a minute since the last intro and refresh. And that 10-year yield, we've seen notch above that 4.5%. Folks get a little anxious. And really, obviously, as I've talked about at length, that 10-year yield is really tightly correlated with your 30-year mortgage. So you are still seeing mortgages at just shy of 7%. So I can't emphasize and underscore this enough, and you're going to hear it in this first part of this talk, is that inflation is very much still with us. And I think if you just go to the grocery store, you will feel it. And I think it's just across the board. And so one of the biggest things that's helped drive down inflation is oil prices. And you really, really see this in the data when you actually chart oil prices, inflation, the federal funds interest rate, and unemployment. And there's a lot of stuff obviously going under the hood, I think, with unemployment as well. So with that, let's just talk for a minute before we get into this podcast. And this podcast and talk, we get a lot into trade, tariffs, China, inflation, policies. So this covers the gauntlet. This is a very good sort of recap of where we were and where we're heading into on April 1st. So this was the beginning of my talk and sort of university tour. I started actually in Lubbock, Texas. That one got postponed because of a power outage. And then I was going, so right after that was at the end of March. Then April 1st, I went to Colorado School of Mines. Shortly after, the following week, I went to Montana Tech, to Butte, and that's also a great fireside chat, which will drop after this one. And then I went back to Lubbock, Texas. So this is the first in the university tour for PetroNerds. This is Colorado School of Mines with Morgan Bazilian at the Payne Institute. So literally cover the entire economy, China, U.S. production. We get into every nook and cranny of this through these questions. So I think you guys are going to love it. But right now, I would say one of the single biggest reasons we're seeing oil prices go up, there's a couple reasons, but it is Iran. It's a lot of talk that, so the U.S. is having talks with Iran about trying to get a deal done. And what we keep hearing from every organization looking at Iran is that they want to increase their uranium enrichment, and that Iran is actually increasing their uranium enrichment. So it's significantly higher than it was, continues to go up each year, and Iran wants a nuclear weapon. And I think we really, really have to appreciate that Iran does want a nuclear weapon, and they're hell-bent on doing it. So I do not think the talks with Iran are going to go well. I don't think we're going to make progress. I think we're going to talk about making progress, and we're probably not going to make progress. Now, that's one factor, right? That we will probably have to sanction Iran. We should already be sanctioning Iran. We're supposed to be sanctioning those barrels, but clearly that's not taking place yet to a significant degree. So that's one big thing on oil. The second big thing on oil is that, well, and I guess number 2 and number 3 is that we have these China-U.S. talks going on in London right now. So as we speak, we have these talks going on in London, these trade talks, right? These are, and right now it sounds like, for what I'm hearing on the news snippets, is that the U.S. is saying, hey, we're willing to give you something here if you're willing to help us on rare earth elements. I don't think this is going to be easy. I certainly think that China is going to do everything they can to get everything they want, and little in return. And it does seem like China is willing to play hardball. Yes, we are meeting with them in London, and that is why you're seeing oil prices to a degree is rising on the optimism, as well as I think the overall stock market. So you have to be a little bit careful of what's, oil prices were very, very oversold, too oversold for supply and demand at the moment. They were pricing in a recession, and now they might be a little bit pricing in on the upside. Now, I'm not saying they should probably be at $65 a barrel, but that optimism and that reversal in that trade is really about the optimism. And the third reason is, and these are all not positive, folks, right? When we talk about Iran and we talk about Russia, these are actually not positive for the health of the global economy in the future, okay? Especially if we have conflict. But the other reason oil prices are up is because Russia, a Ukrainian official over the weekend came out and said, here's what Russia actually wants. Now, This is on the Institute for Study of War, and this is a map that was posted. It basically shows that Russia's looking to seize half of Ukraine and basically push those buffer lines that they have of all that eastern side of Ukraine. They're obviously looking to push that inward. And by the end of 2026, Russia's looking to have seized half of Ukraine. Now, whether they can do that is a big question mark. That it's going to be very, very difficult. Obviously, that's their goal. So what that means is that, and probably why there's an impetus for Ukraine to do that, is that the means that they Russia wants to do this, right? So it means that we're going to have to sanction Russia, sanction those barrels, and put more pressure on Russia. Also, what happened over the past weekend, and why you saw prices starting to come up last weekend, was that you had this attack on the weekend prior, a couple of weeks ago. You had Ukraine launch a very, very impressive drone strike within Russia. So the fact that Ukraine was able to get in Russian territory, it took over 18 months. It was a campaign not completely dissimilar to what Israel did with both the pagers and the walkie-talkies. But Ukraine spent 18 months getting drones within Russia, smuggling them into Russia, then getting them on trucks, and then having them all come out at once and basically attacking a lot of facilities within Russia. So that certainly was something edging up on prices. Now, that was the same weekend. This was like June 3rd. This was the same weekend that we this was the same weekend that we had the OPEC meeting. And what was very interesting was the fact that on Bloomberg and CNBC, nobody was talking about, they mentioned Ukraine, but nobody was talking about this. And I think the problem is that at these OPEC meetings, when everyone's in Vienna and they're doing this, nobody wants to admit the elephant in the room is that Russia, this actor that's waging war on Ukraine, is part of OPEC, right? And that they're all talking with them, and so they don't want to call them out, and that they need to call them out. This is reality. This is war. This is truth. And the same goes for a little bit for Iran. I think we do not need to be placating Iran. So there's a lot of realities here, but that is why you're seeing oil prices up to $65 a barrel, is because of Iran's continuing wanting to enrich, is because of the drone strike that you saw from Ukraine into Russia, and because of these plans, this map that came out of saying that Russia wants half of Ukraine. So those are all the big reasons, and the China-US talks, the optimism around them. I just want to tell everyone, you're going to hear a lot about China within this talk with Morgan Bazilian at Colorado School of Mines, is that I am deeply passionate about the China issue. We do not appreciate China as a bigger threat than Russia. Yes, they are absolutely in bed together. Yes, China is funding this war with Russia. Yes, China is making it happen because they're giving them all the weapons and the tools and machinery. And yes, China is buying all the crude oil from them, and coal and grain and everything else. And so they're directly helping funding this war, but they're also providing them equipment as well as chips and ammunition and all kinds of things in return. So with that, folks, I really, really hope you guys enjoy this conversation and talk with Morgan Bazilian at the Colorado School of Mines. Can't wait to hear the feedback. The latest podcast with Doug Sandridge was an absolute hit. If you have not tuned in, folks, please do. And with that, folks, talk to you soon. Bye.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us in person and online. For the people online, we are at the Colorado School of Mines in beautiful Golden, Colorado. It is the first day of April, I believe, in 2025. And this is part of the Payne Institute for Public Policy's thought leadership seminars. And I'm really thrilled to have Trisha Curtis with us, who is certainly one of the most thoughtful and informed thought leaders in the areas of what we're going to talk about today, from inflation to China to oil markets. And I won't have to do too much talking. Trisha knows an enormous amount about these topics, and I'm just really honored you to be with us.
Oh, I'm honored to be here. I'm really pumped. So thank you guys for having me, and thank you guys for showing up. It's not quite super sunny, but I feel like it wants to come out today.
That's what it seems like. And thanks for joining. For those of you in the room, if you haven't seen, there's free lunch. So there is such a thing as a free lunch. So Trisha, there's a ton going on, and I think it's hard for all of us, even those of us who try to pay attention to the energy sector and to global economics, to make sense of it all, just to keep up. And I guess I wanted to start with the wider economic framing with you about what you're seeing from your clients, what you're seeing from your research in the new administration's approach to macroeconomics or trade.
Well, so firstly, I would say we're one day into, or tomorrow is supposed to be Reciprocal Tariff Day or Liberation Day. So I will say that I'm a little bit more in probably the Morgan Stanley camp of that we don't know until we know. So the market has done a lot of freaking out and is freaking out. Everybody's selling off. there's multiple factors taking place. And so the first is that, and I'm going to be very honest, and it's uncomfortable for people to talk about, we've had massive inflation for the past 4 years, and we've had incredible fiscal spending for the past 4 years. And you can absolutely spend and inflate your way out of a problem, and that's what the previous administration did. And so you can mask the health of an underlying economy, and that's what we had for 4 years. And I knew this because you could go around to any major CEO in the country and talk to them, and they will tell you, they have had lots of regulation under the previous administration, but they had a lot of loose money. And so when you had $27 trillion in global economic stimulus after COVID, that money was sloshing around the system for a long time. That created a lot of inflation. And now you have this entrenched inflation. And so I live, eat, and breathe kind of the stock market and the economy, and that's how you have to follow oil, is really through the stock market and then through other means. And so when you're watching the stock market, that's what you see, is that all this money's kind of moving around. There's a lot of retail spending, there's a lot of retail traders, and so everybody's sort of waiting for the shoe to drop. And the biggest talk was always about the consumer, right? The consumer's healthy, the consumer's fine, no, the consumer's still spending. Well, the consumer finally seems to be rolling over. And what happens is that it's not so much, everybody talks about it being high interest rates, it's really inflation, right? The consumer gets tapped out when the cost of something, that pizza, the water, anything, gets so high that, it's not just the pizza, it's not just the water, it's not just the pop, it's their utility bills, it's their housing, it's their ability to own a home, it's the ability to drive their car, it's the ability to purchase a car, it's the ability to get insurance on a car. Everything has gone up so much, so fast in such a compressed time period that it's finally coming home to roost. So I think you have that backdrop of that's what the administration came into, was a pretty unhealthy consumer, folks that $50,000 and under are actually just getting beyond stretched. $100,000 and under, they're absolutely getting stretched. And I would even wager to say that if your household and you're making over $200,000 a year, it doesn't feel that great, because with that amount of inflation, you just lost that spending power. So you have that. Well, that all works when people have jobs. So 4.1% unemployment, we have jobs, right? People have jobs. The musical chairs is where we're at right now. And this is where the stock market's starting to feel anxiety, and people start getting scared. And when I had slides for years, past 2 years, where I just have like white swans and black swans on the slide. And I would say we're like in the pond, and the swans are all around us, and there's black swans, they're just swimming up to us now. And we know the data, we know what it's gonna be. We have all the bad data around us. The data just kind of swims up to you, and then people get scared and they freak out. And so it all works, like housing works, but we all were here. You probably, if you're in Golden, I can only imagine what the Bananaville spending was on housing during COVID, but everyone during COVID decided that they needed a big kitchen, and they needed a patio, and they needed a big yard, and they needed everything. They needed a second house. And so we spent like drunken sailors as consumers, and the government also did that. And so then even when COVID was over, then you had fiscal spending in Washington go crazy through congressional spending and through the White House. And so we've had a lot of spending, and that has kept things up, but it's also led to inflation. And so now if you think about it, if one of the biggest policies of the Trump administration is to cut back spending, you're gonna feel it, because the big inflated balloon we have is starting to leak some air, and that air is that spending. I'm a federal contractor. I have been cut as well, so I know exactly what it feels like. I know what it's like to work in the oil and gas industry. I'm third generation. I have lost my job in 2020. I have revamped my business in PetroNerds and doubled down on it in 2020. So that's fun, doubling down on a business called PetroNerds in 2020 when everybody hates oil and gas. This is not an easy world to live in and to do business. And so you have to be extremely sharp on this stuff. And right now, I wouldn't say we're like in an unprecedented volatility, but we're damn close, because we haven't even talked about geopolitics and China and everything. But the US economy is a really big deal, particularly when it comes to oil, because we're 20% of global oil demand. So we probably need to spend a little more time in questions talking about inflation and the US economy, but that's just kind of a starting point of sort of where we're at, and I don't think we're gonna have tariffs, right? They're gonna come into place tomorrow. We had them set about a month ago for Mexico and Canada. Those were about China. I don't know why the administration's not being a little more clear about that. They are about China. You have so many shipments coming in through Mexico through the de minimis rule, which is $800 per person per day, that comes in through packages that anyone in here can buy from Shein or Temu, and they can just get it. It's unregulated, which is not good, and so you have no recourse if that poisons your child, or you get hurt, or you bought a bad crib or something like that, which happens all the time. And it just is it doesn't help our competition. I do want to get into why China is so competitive and why they can actually do that and why they can undercut prices.
forced labor and coal are certainly two of the primary sources that they're able to do that through. So it is, some of these tariffs are absolutely about China. When we talk about Venezuela and doubling tariffs or coupling sanctions and tariffs, that is about China. You're seeing oil prices up in the past couple of days. We're knocking on the door of $72 a barrel for WTI. That's because of Trump's comments on Russia and potentially having to sanction Russia. So I hope I'm giving a flavor that there is a crap ton going on right now. And it is hard for people to understand and wrap their arms around. And so I am not sleeping a whole lot lately.
Awesome. So let's, if you don't mind, before going to China, let's stay domestic.
Yep.
So if you could give us a sense of not just the oil market domestically and how it relates internationally, but how the domestic oil companies and players are navigating this uncertainty.
So I would say the biggest questions I get from the industry and from clients is they're navigating is questioning policies right now. So $72 of oil, they're navigating it just fine. They're complaining a lot. I'll be very honest. The oil and gas industry seems to be complaining. We are not hearing. Chris Wright's been very vocal. He's been, talking out loud. I think he's, I know him personally. He's a good friend. He's a class act for a human being, and I think he's done a bang-up job already in the Department of Energy. But in terms of the response by the industry, there hasn't been a clear articulation of policies from the White House and Department of Energy to the oil and gas industry. And so the response by the oil and gas industry has been, we're concerned about prices. They're concerned about tariffs with regards to steel and inputs. And they say, if you want us to, firstly, they always ask me, what does drill, baby, drill mean? And secondly, the biggest question is, what price does Trump want for oil? And so I spend 2 hours with clients. Let's talk about that. Honestly, and I'm giving you free intel here, drill baby drill is really about we're making this country open for business. So we're going to make sure that you can access permits, you can actually have federal lease sales. And we did have permitting, we did have federal permitting under Biden. But what we started with in the first 2 months of the administration, and it's important to point this out because if you're noticing that the Trump administration has not filled a lot of positions, they haven't. The Republicans tend to do things very differently than the Democrats. They don't put a tranche of people to go through security and then they get passed through. This is it's very ad hoc. It's pretty messy. And so you have I feel like you have a lot of people underneath other people that are not filled. And so that means that you just are understaffed. Well, in the first 2 months of the Biden administration, they removed all permitting on federal land. Every single permit on federal land for oil and gas was stopped. And that was to create a bargain within the House and Senate to say, hey, let's pass these people, right? Let's get the confirmations for these people. Kind of a dirty way to do it, but it seems to, worked, or it seems to have worked. That was their play. But it set a tone for the oil and gas industry. Did not really, it wasn't a positive tone for the oil and gas industry to say, you cannot get permits on federal land because we're doing some bargaining in DC. And so we did see permitting on federal land, much slower than we saw obviously under previous administrations. It was difficult to re-up a permit that expired on federal land. And then we didn't see lease sales. So we had actually one federal lease sale in the Gulf of Mexico. It was a record lease sale. Of course, it was going to be a record lease sale because everyone knew there wasn't going to be another one. So that was serious. And so the Gulf of Mexico is we have shale in multiple basins in the US in the lower 48, which is awesome. But the Gulf of Mexico it's the Gulf of Mexico, right? Or Gulf of America, or whatever you want to call it now. It is a prolific oil and gas basin, right? We have a lot of oil and gas within it. And so companies want to buy and drill in the Gulf of Mexico, and you have to, it's not just an onshore well that you do and you can do one off and it's $10 million and it's one and done. You have to spend hundreds of billions of dollars. So you want that type of investment, right? You want long-term investment. People look through prices, they have a long-term investment horizon. So those lease sales actually matter a great deal to the long-term investment thesis in America. And so that's the stuff that really kind of impacted the industry then. And now I would say that drill baby drill is, hey, we're going to give you the leases, right? You're going to be able to enter in a contract with the government. You're going to be able to get your permits. We're going to have lease sales, whether that's Wyoming. We're definitely seeing the activity uptick in Wyoming. And so I hear less whining from private operators than I hear from a little bit from, and they're not saying necessarily publicly, but you're seeing some of them say, $50 oil obviously isn't going to work. Well, $50 oil isn't going to work. Newsflash though, $80 oil is not going to work either because the U.S. economy and the global economy cannot handle $80 oil. And I would actually say that if WTI presses 75, we're going to start feeling some more pain. So you don't want $80 oil, right? The industry can't handle it. The consumer cannot handle it. The global economy cannot handle it. So what does Trump want? I'm guessing he probably wanted a 50 handle. If I'm Chris Wright, I'm telling him he needs to go for 60 handle, and I would love 65 would be great. It's more about steadiness, right? If we went to 65 and we just stayed there, the industry might complain, but they're going to be fine. You can make oil, $65 oil. You can make money, $65 oil. No, it's not 80. It's not perfect, but you can. And then it's really about, I think, also natural gas prices. I mean, natural gas prices, if they stay $4 a 1,000 cubic feet, that's really important for the oil operators. They can take a lower oil price. So if you couple slightly higher natural gas prices, slightly lower oil prices, and deregulation, I think you get this kind of drill baby drill scenario where we're open to business. Now, will we grow to that, will we grow massively? Probably not. I mean, growth is dependent upon adding wells, right? Adding that stack and actually completing wells. So there's a number of factors there. But I would say the industry, at these prices, it is healthy. And so I think that there needs to be better articulation, probably from the administration on multiple factors, but we do need to be talking about that. And then the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, that puts a floor on prices, right? If you refill the SPR, you are putting a floor. So I call it the Trump put, or the floor on prices is we are going to be refilling the SPR at 50. So as an industry, we do not have to be worried about oil prices going below 50 or even the 40s, because that's when you refill the SPR. And I believe that's probably been talked quietly to the Saudis. If it hasn't been, I'm sure it should be, that they know that, right? That oil prices aren't going to get smashed because we do have to refill the SPR. And Trump and Chris Wright are very committed to that.
Cool. Just one piece on that. Can you tell us, I know you know this very well, but the difference between how the majors and the independents in the States are reacting and operating now? Because I feel like some of them are more upset than others, or yeah.
Yeah, so they it is interesting, because I thought that we've had a lot of capitulation. I think that's the word of the day if you went to like CERA Week, which I didn't, but that's what kind of came out, was Fatih Birol from the IEA heavily capitulated. Like, he was literally, they put his face on CNBC that night and said, this is the definition of capitulation, because he has been going to CERA Week and all over the world telling people they shouldn't invest in oil and gas. And all of a sudden, it's super cute. He comes to CERA Week in March of this year and says, hey, we need to invest in oil and gas. Well, that's not a shocker, Fatih, but thank you for letting us know after you said that we don't need to. So that's like, we heard that, but then we heard a lot of industry leaders like Harold Hamm with Continental Resources, who's not the CEO, but he's the chairman, still has a significant sway. He was talking about peak oil and peak shale. Vicky Holub and Occidental Petroleum were talking about it as well, and some other folks. Scott Sheffield, certainly, he was that got onto CNBC and the market as well. So he started talking, and Bloomberg probably as well, where he's talking about peak shale. And so that's what kind of came from CERA Week. And so those are all like, Scott's not actually in the game right now. Continental is a private company. Oxy is a public company. So folks have been more vocal than others. Darren Woods, the CEO of Exxon, after Trump was elected, he actually talked to the Wall Street Journal about saying that the Trump administration should stay in the Paris Climate Accords. I thought that was interesting. I didn't think it was correct, or I didn't agree with it. And since then, he's been pretty quiet. Mike Wertz, has come out, I think it was post-election, and said, hey, we're ready to get to business in the U.S. They're also kind of streamlining their business and just coring up and focusing on, things that matter. That's probably not the right. They're coring up, they don't have a ton of stuff abroad, right? They're focusing on the U.S. So it really depends on the company. I don't think there's a whole lot of people being vocal. I hear personally, though, a little more complaining. Yeah. And I think it's interesting, because I thought there'd be a lot more complaining under the regulations of the Biden administration were the rules and regulations were so onerous, not just on the oil and gas industry, but just the business community. People spent millions, tens of millions of dollars just on lawyers. And so that was huge. I mean, so that regulatory monkey has been lifted off people's backs. Now it's just a different thing that we're playing, right? We can loosen up some spending there, but now if you're going after fiscal spending, again, you're taking that sort of steam out of the tank.
So before we go over to China, just because you referenced it a couple of times, how about North America? So what are you seeing in the Canada and Mexico issues with trade, inflation, and oil and gas?
So those are some big separate things. So maybe we should back up a little bit just on the public-private companies. So the majority of our production is in the hands of public companies, but the activity, so the actual drilling, completing activity, we have a lot of private companies that are doing a lot. So I really think it's important to appreciate the role of private companies. It's huge. You cannot just let all the big boys do the business, because it's the private companies who have 1 and 2 rigs. They're the ones who go de-risk stuff, right? They're the ones that, so the industry seems to be under the assumption now that we have found everything, and now we're just coring things up, and now we're just drilling what we have left. That is really adorable, because that's what people would have said in 2010, right? We found it all, we understand. So you will have evolutions of this. We will continue to have them. And with $4 natural gas, say we have $4.50 this year and we spike, you will see companies pushing out to different fringy areas that have not been drilled before. Those will be private companies that will go de-risk acreage. Then the publics will come around and be like, hey, I like this. I'll go work with this. And so that thesis will kind of fall on its head. That's why I say that's adorable, and that those forecasts will be wrong. That being said, though, so I think that we will see some resiliency in the private guys, especially if oil prices are relatively healthy and natural gas. And then the public guys, they've just been pretty steady. If you follow the rig count and activity, they're pretty steady. But if we take Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. holistically, Mexico has some serious energy problems of their own, right? They have serious economic issues, lots of serious issues that they need to deal with. But energy, they need to beef up oil and gas production. They're not. It's hard to do, you have to have the right government. You have to have, the reason people like to drill and complete wells in the US is because even under onerous administrations, we have rule of law. You can get a contract, you can do business in the US. It is much different in other countries, Mexico included. And so if you wanna bring up oil and gas production, the problem is in a lot of these countries, people just see money and they want to get rich. And so that's what happens, and you have corruption. So the trade issue is a whole separate one. Canada, though, we get 4 million barrels a day from Canada. So most of our imports, we import about 6 million barrels a day now. 4 million barrels a day of that is largely heavy Canadian crude oil. This is oil sands crude that comes from Alberta. We send it down to the Gulf Coast. We have complex refineries with coking capacity. They refine this crude. They get a lot out of it. It works out great. A lot of that crude goes into the Midwest as well. And then we also get this awesome crude. It's called syn crude or synthetic crude. They actually scoop this up and mine it, and then they kind of upgrade it, and it becomes really, really flexible in a refinery because it's already kind of refined a little bit. So it works in every refinery. You actually pay a premium for it. It's awesome stuff, right? And you can get diesel and gasoline and everything out of it. So we get both of those types of crude from the oil sands. I am all pro oil sands. It is not nearly as bad as if you think it is. I encourage you to go up there and look at it, and also look at the footprint. It's not nearly as bad on CO2 emissions, or actually from a land standpoint, especially the stuff that they do underground. But they have a ton of crude oil. It's growing, so they're pushing that. And with high oil prices we've seen in the last few years, their production growth has grown. But obviously that 4 million barrels a day that we get, if it is tariffed, and if I'm advising Trump, I would say absolutely don't tariff that crude, right? That's the thing you want to leave alone, largely because this is a global oil market. If they tariff that crude, we put a 10% tariff on 4 million barrels a day. That's just going to actually get pushed throughout the oil market. Trump doesn't want higher oil prices, and that's what he's going to get if he tariffs any kind of crude. So, but we export 4 million barrels a day. So we produce 13.5 million barrels a day of crude oil right now, of predominantly light sweet crude, higher API gravity, and so at the Bakken they produce 43 API gravity. That's the same type of crude that we used to get from Nigeria. Now we don't get any crude from Nigeria, and we get very little crude from say Saudi Arabia, because we produce all that crude. So now we export 4 million barrels a day of light sweet crude, we import 4 million barrels a day of heavy crude, works out in the wash. We are a net exporter. We are the largest oil and gas producer in the world. We're the largest crude oil exporter, crude and product. We export more crude and product than any country in the world, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia. We export, that doesn't even include the LNG, the liquefied natural gas. We also are the largest exporter. This is really important to say, because you didn't hear this over the past 4 years. You don't hear it enough for the oil and gas industry. We are the oil and gas powerhouse of the entire world. And it is about time that we embrace that and understand it, and actually use it to lower our utility bills, electricity bills, and actually help our allies and the rest of the world. We absolutely have the capacity to do that. We could solve the world's energy problems pretty quickly by exporting LNG and a little bit of coal to backstop the LNG, and we would probably lower CO2 emissions. I guarantee you we would lower CO2 emissions in the process.
So on that last point then, that's terrific, and thanks for the context there with Canada especially. So if we became the largest LNG supplier under the last administration and the largest producer of oil, what is that delta? What else gets done now that that leads to those things you said about supporting our allies and shoring up our economy and those things? Like, what's the delta?
Okay, so the previous administration, most of that was because of high oil prices. So high oil prices, your war in Ukraine in 2022 was the first time you had a high natural gas prices since we found the Marcellus shale and since we started the shale boom in the U.S. That was the first time we had sustained high natural gas prices. So it was the war in Ukraine, it was high oil prices. Biden directly contributed to high oil prices inadvertently because if we had the Keystone XL pipeline, we would have had more crude coming from Canada. That would allow them to produce probably a little bit more. So there was a lot of buffers we lost some of those buffers. And then the administration sold off the strategic petroleum reserve to lower prices. Not because we didn't have enough crude oil on the global market, it was because they didn't like oil prices. First time, lots of administrations like to sell it off as a piggy bank because they like the money. This was to actually lower prices. It did. You can see a correlation. So it lowered prices, not really what you should do with the strategic petroleum reserve, but it was done. But really it was about high oil prices, right? Exxon and Chevron, they got nasty letters from Biden saying, lower prices at the pump and all this stuff and things that were ridiculous. And the industry didn't push back on that enough, but really it was high prices that led the industry to keep doing things. What you did see was less wells being drilled and longer laterals. So we are doing so much more with less. If you look at the rig count, like we dropped from COVID. So this is about COVID and this is about oil prices. And so the Biden administration post-COVID, we lost a lot of oil and gas production because we shut it in, then we brought it back online. So the past 4 years was like bringing that production back. And then, they just didn't want to admit it. They also didn't have anyone in the administration that had any knowledge of hydrocarbons. That was intentional and unintentional. I don't know if there were so many of them that were 25 ideologues from Harvard that they just couldn't handle, talking about oil and gas, but they didn't have anyone. So they literally didn't know what was going on. And so if it sounded weird on TV when they say one thing and do another, that's because they actually had no idea what they were doing with LNG or otherwise. And so then you had all the people around them when they did the LNG export pause in January, they're like, oh, it's no big deal. And except the entire world market thought it was a massive deal. So there was a lot of confusion there, but that's where the disconnect really is that the high prices and the industry just going to town and doing business. And then now the industry is like, well, crap, we have lower prices. Well, so you're not going to have that same level of growth. And also we went from, we were just under 13 million barrels a day pre-COVID in 2019. We clipped that. We went north of 13 million barrels a day. We brought that production back up and now we're at 13 and a half. And so you have to be thinking strategically about how would you grow that. And I think we don't have national energy policies. We need to be thinking at Department of Energy, we need national security policies on how do we grow and maintain this oil and gas production and then export it. And so the export piece is really important because you have to have pipelines. As any of you are in the oil and gas business, you know that if you're looking at the Wilson Basin or you're looking here in the DJ in Colorado or the Permian Basin, no oil basin in the world ever makes it unless it has pipeline capacity to actually move those barrels to market. And typically it actually needs redundancy in that pipeline. Natural gas is the same way. So for liquefied natural gas, natural gas is a 400 billion cubic feet per day market globally. We are on the water in 2023, there was about 53 billion cubic feet per day on the water. It's a fraction of the global market. So it's actually very regionally constrained via pipeline. So you have to compress it, you have to pipe it. You can't put it in a truck just like oil, you can't put it on a barge. It has to have more sophisticated form of transportation because it's a gas. And then you have to turn it into a liquid, then you have to put it on a ship, then you have to turn it back into a gas, and then it has to get into these places. So it's relatively complex. It works great, we have a ton of it, but this grew, so you have to build the infrastructure for this. So you have to build the pipelines, you have to build the actual export infrastructure. And lo and behold, if you put a pin on permits, you're going to throw this whole investment thesis and infrastructure in a question mark, and then you've just told Asia, you can't depend on the U.S. for long-term supplies of LNG. So you should be focusing on nuclear, which isn't great from just a power dynamic standpoint, and it's or from a military standpoint. And then you should also be focusing on coal, which if you were fighting CO2 emissions, which the previous administration said they were doing, they didn't do jack on it. They did nothing. In fact, we had the most significant rise in CO2 emissions we've ever seen because China just went to town on manufacturing things. So nothing happened on that front. So that's why I say we are kind of getting back to business of, at least I will say in the stock market and at least from this administration, CO2 emissions, we're not discussing it. I hate to break to everyone, it's okay that we're not discussing it because our CO2 CO2 emissions are declining as a country. They're declining in Europe for the wrong reasons. They're declining because their economy is tanking. And then they're rising in China because China's manufacturing everything with coal. And unless you're going to go to war with them, you're not going to stop that. Probably going to go to war with them anyway at some point in the future. So it's really like we have to move past the CO2 emissions conversation and talk about the realities of energy. And that sucks for a lot of people, but it's really, really important.
Great. So let's take that coal thread then. If you don't mind, can we start with U.S. coal? I'm sort of pointing north, but from where we're sitting today. But so how about how the domestic U.S. coal market is, and specifically the export market, and then we can move to China. In other words, are we going to see a huge change in the domestic coal market, or is people upset or happy, or what's happening?
I don't think we're going to see a big change because this is part of this whole something we saw over. We've seen we went from 13 cents a kilowatt hour in electricity prices to 18 cents a kilowatt hour in 4 years. And so part of that big inflation piece, a big part is electricity prices. It is much higher in Colorado. It is well north of 18 cents a kilowatt hour in Denver. My utility bill is about $300 a month for a 1,400 square foot little Victorian house in Sunnyside. It's unbelievably expensive. So we've seen really high prices, particularly in Colorado. And this is what's happened is that wasn't just the Biden administration. States, particularly Colorado, as of this year, beginning with this year to 2031, Colorado is decommissioning every coal-fired power plant in this state. There's 7. They contribute over a third of your power that you're getting right now. A third. So this state, under Jared Polis, is decommissioning a third of the power generation with plans to shove a bunch of wind and solar into the grid. We've already seen what has happened with the shoving of the wind and solar into the grid. It's largely been wind, as it actually has not been that much solar, but we've shoved it into the grid, and there's no place on the planet where you've added wind and solar into a grid and you have not increased electricity prices. And that's because it's completely distorted, and it's drastically subsidized on the front end by China. Then when it comes into the US, it's subsidized. And then, so you can shove a bunch of wind and solar into the grid. They don't pay the same costs and fees. And then it's very hard for natural gas and coal to compete. And then the consumer ends up bearing the brunt of this. So what you've seen is actually utility companies do really, really well. I am not a fan of Excel right now, or many utility companies, because they're just not being honest with the consumer about what is happening and how they're delivering power. They say that they're following the queue of the regulations, but they seem to be setting and close to the regulations as well. And I'm pretty uncomfortable with that within the state of Colorado. We have got to start to have some policies that put the consumer first on affordability and reliability for power. We do not have that in Colorado anymore. It is about going green. That's the buck stops with that, is that it's all about greening up the grid. So coal matters in that, because in a place like Colorado, you have these plans to decommission these coal-fired power plants. Well, where I'm from in both Wyoming and Northwest Colorado, the country is getting most of its coal from Wyoming. Wyoming's still exporting most of the coal. We have 2 of the largest surface coal mines in the world in Wyoming, outside of Gillette, Wyoming. The 3rd is in Indonesia. But places like Craig, Colorado, where I'm from, they are decommissioning the Hayden power plant, the Craig power plant. But the Trapper coal mine is one of those coal mines that provides that coal. Well, Trapper, over time, because they put these policies in place a long time ago, it's now going to stop producing coal. Well, that coal mine, or that coal-fired power plant in Craig that powers Northwest Colorado, they say they don't have a plan yet of what's going to replace that. So it's really adorable that, again, they don't have a plan to replace it. They're going to replace it. They put some studies. And, if you go to a meeting in Craig, they'll buy you lunch. They'll even pay, they'll even give you a babysitter so you can come to the meeting and you can talk about this. They won't solve the problem of where you're going to get the power, but they will buy you lunch and they'll give you a babysitter for an hour. And to me, it's just ridiculous. It's missing the heart of the problem of that people have to turn their lights on. And we have to realize that that's how you power a country. That's how you make things. That's how you live. That's how you survive. That's how you refrigerate your food, is with power generation. And so when we are decommissioning coal-fired power generation to this degree, like we're doing in Colorado, we've seen this across the U.S., most prolifically in California. And it's coal's your baseload power in Colorado. So when you decommission that and then you add the wind and solar, that's when you get the price increases. You see that in California, where you decommission the baseload nuclear and then you add the wind and solar and then you get the price increases. So you're decreasing that dispatchable, reliable baseload power, and then you're adding the intermittent sources, and these prices go up exponentially. And so that's what we've actually seen just over across the U.S. It's the same thing. So coal coal's role, and I say this, I know people don't like it, it's so important to just stem the bleeding, right? Stop the decommissioning of coal, and you can continue adding natural gas into the grid, which means you can continue actually lowering CO2 emissions, you can continue cleaning things up, you can continue adding power generation, but you gotta stop adding crappy wind and solar. It is not a good form of energy, its power density is crap, it doesn't compare, it's a fraction of the power density. Wind is 1,000 times less the power density of natural gas. So it's high BTU, it's high energy, so it works well for power generation, and we don't have a supplement to that. So that's the big problem, is that we have to stem that decommissioning. I think under this administration they're trying to, of basically making it up to choice that you don't have to stop the decommissioning of coal. In the previous administration, through the EPA and other regulations, that was happening, right? And even for forcing carbon capture on natural gas power plants. Well, so you're forcing carbon capture on natural gas power plants. That's the base load we have for the US. That's over half our power generation. So you've guaranteed escalating costs for the consumer. So you have to say, and I think Chris Wright's done this really well, is that yes, we have global CO2 emission growth. Yes, we have climate change that happens over a period of time, but you have to say, is the cure worse than the disease? And absolutely, we had 4 years to prove to you that the cure was absolutely worse than the disease, and that was very, very quick. So imagine if you continued on that track that barely started, and the economic pain was huge. So coal's role is that, it doesn't get enough love. I encourage people to go out to visit a coal mine in Wyoming and actually see how they run, because they run really well. I mean, they're so damn clean, you could eat off the coal mine floor. They run extremely efficiently, very lean, because they've been under pressure for decades, largely because of natural gas, but also, harsh regulations. There's actually basically effective moratorium on a new coal mine in the US. You can't develop a new coal mine in the US. That's hilarious when we're competing with China. And China's, just for perspective, we have 4,500 terawatt hours of power generation in this country, 4,500. China has 9,500 terawatt hours of power generation. So they have double our power generation, and the 5,700 terawatt hours of that 9,500 are coal, all coal. So they have more coal-fired power generation than we have total power generation. You can't compete with that. You just can't, because that's cheap, reliable, and then they further subsidize it. And so when we are fighting a game of CO2 emissions, they're eating our lunch when it comes to competition. And it's not just competition for making cheap t-shirts and stuff, it is a competition for making military equipment and weapons and systems, and decimating manufacturing so that Auto and Ford and all the auto companies and GM and are not available to help you in the future when you actually need them.
Great. So I'd love to hear more about China and coal and the pacing threat of the United States military, and even how they're making all the photovoltaics, the solar panels. But would you just give us a sense of, so that coal in Wyoming, how's the export market looking?
So I think you had asked me last night about this. The coal guys saying that they were, what was it, Coal Association?
Some coal association, yeah.
So I'm not familiar with coal associations saying they weren't happy about the tariffs or the
Chinese
ships.
Affiliated Chinese-built ships.
Right.
Yeah.
So most ships are built in China, which is another whole problem that we have to deal with as a country in a world. But that's because, again, they can subsidize it and it's cheap, so it's hard to compete with that. So from a coal industry, China is self-sufficient in their coal production, but they also import some. So they are certainly probably importing a little bit from the US. I would honestly say we need to stop exporting all energy forms to China. We could do that pretty quickly, but that should just be a given. If you have an adversary, just stop exporting energy. We don't want our energy to go to them, and we can send it elsewhere. They're getting a lot of coal from Russia right now, so they're stockpiling coal. That's the other thing to think about coal. It's extremely energy secure, because it's not like natural gas. You don't have to compress it. You don't have to put it in a pipeline. You don't have to turn it into a gas again after you liquefy it and put it on a ship. You can put this in rail. You can put it on a barge. You can put it in the back of a truck. You can just stack it up and never use it. And I do think in the U.S. we need to be thinking about that too, is that stack it up. You don't necessarily have to use it. If we've got better alternatives, awesome. But from an energy security standpoint, you cannot, you underline, circle, highlight coal over and over and over again. Because that's why China uses it, is extremely energy secure. So they have enough of it. They would like to have more of it. We actually have more reserves of coal than China does. And so if China had the natural gas and the oil we did, they wouldn't be using coal. They'd be using natural gas and oil. They don't have it. So you have to think of China as and I don't say this to be warmongery, but the only country you can actually liken China to is Germany in World War II, because Germany was a coal power without oil, and China is a coal power without oil. And so it's a very similar situation. So you have to look at it from that lens. But from the US, when we think about coal, it has been really decimated from a regulatory standpoint, from a market standpoint. And so it's prudent that oil and gas and all energy, traditional energy, really looks at coal and realizes natural gas has to know we need coal, because you cannot add more natural gas into the grid if you don't have the baseload coal, because when natural gas prices spike, then you need that cheap, reliable baseload coal to backstop that. And then you get all the benefits of natural gas without the price spikes, right? We don't have huge issues on the prices anyway, but as a consumer, you were paying $18 a standard cubic feet, 1,000 cubic feet. That's what you're paying, $18 for natural gas last year from the utility companies. Do you know what the natural gas price was last year that the industry got? And they didn't even get that? It was $2. Henry Hub was $2, but you as a consumer were charged $18. That's called highway robbery. That's what I think the administration should be going after, is the corruption. And I'm going to say it, what the utility companies are doing is wrong, and they are not passing on cost saving on the consumer. They're saying they're spending on infrastructure development, but it's hard to believe that when they hate on natural gas so much that they're building out prolific infrastructure. I don't know the infrastructure that's been built to my house from Excel. I haven't seen a new pipeline. I haven't seen anything new going on. So they are actually, what they're doing, and they just don't want to say it, is they're tacking on really high increases on natural gas prices, particularly Excel is, and they're paying for the very, very costly renewables that they're adding into the grid. And so they're just moving around some of these costs. They say that's not what they're doing. I completely disagree. $18 an MCF when the actual price is $2 is wrong, and that needs to be addressed. We don't see that in oil. I mean, when oil prices go up and oil prices go down, you quickly see that at the pump. Oil prices go up, you're going to see that in the pump in about 3 weeks. Oil prices go down, you're going to see that at the pump in about 3 weeks. The same needs to happen for natural gas, because we are producing more natural gas than any country in the entire world, about 128 billion cubic feet per day out of that 400 billion cubic feet per day market. We should not be having price increases on electricity, like bar none. So coal's role in that is that it needs to stop dying, and the natural gas industry needs to appreciate that we need to stop hammering on coal. We need to appreciate that it does have a role, and that if you really want to work on the CO2 emissions, then you can you can clean this up. But we have regulations from an air emission standpoint, NOx and SOx. We have the highest regulations for air standards in the entire world. So we have higher than actually Europe. So we don't really have that problem, and we have a lot of scrubbers. But I'm all for more technology going onto that and to enable. But it's really about making sure people have access to that power generation.
Great. So let's talk about China. So it's our military's pacing threat. People are worried in the Department of Defense and even down in Colorado Springs about war with China, as everybody has heard. So how do you think about that from an energy lens? Or how have you been thinking about it from an energy lens?
Well, I've been thinking about it for a while, because I've been doing that type of work that's been in the confidential sphere. Like energy is everything, and Chris Wright says that, but it's really important to say over and over, like, energy is everything. It's not a sector of the economy, it is the economy. So when you start thinking about it like that, then when you start looking at China and you realize that there's been a nice continuity, a nice thread within China over the history of their leadership. They actually have a lot of continuity in leadership anyway. You've only had 5 leaders in China. You've had from Mao, like Mao Zedong, to Xi Jinping. There's only been 5 leaders: Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping. And actually, they're all really similar, right? They're all they're all a little bit crazy. They're all totalitarian leaders. They're all authoritarian. Deng Xiaoping was not the reformer that you think he was. He was pretty bad, just like Mao Zedong. So you have this continuity, but you also have continuity in terms of like things like energy, right? They're a coal power, a modern coal power today. They're the 21st century's modern coal power, but they've always been a coal power. And so when you actually look at primary energy consumption, and I think this is something that Chris Wright's been talking about, of like global primary energy consumption, I think from the latest Energy Institute data, it's something like 83% is traditional fuels, is crude oil, natural gas, and coal. It's actually more than that. There's a chunk that is something like 7 to 8% that is renewables, which would be wind, solar, and biomass. But as Chris Wright points out, there's a thermal grade, there's a scale up you have to do for the wind and solar, and so it's really more like 4%. So your primary energy consumption, wind and solar, is probably about 4%. So your traditional fuels are still like over probably 90% of your primary energy consumption today in 2025. And in China, that's very much the case. So if you nerd out on primary energy consumption in China, what you'll see is that for the US, for the world, we still consume about over 30% of our primary energy consumption in the US is oil. That makes sense, right? Same in Europe, even as green as they are in Europe, we drive, right? We consume oil within the transportation sphere. So think diesel, think your packages from Amazon, think rail, like that's how we consume. Diesel is very correlated to building houses and everything in construction and just a normal consumer economy. China does not have a normal consumer economy. In fact, their consumer economy is going like this in real estate, and their manufacturing economy and their state-led industrial sector goes like this. And so that's all built on coal. So for China, their primary energy consumption is about 20% oil, which is fascinating, and everything else, about 80%, is really power generation and electricity. That is a big problem, and it should be a huge wake-up call. Like, the fact that China has 9,500 terawatt hours of power generation, by the way, that's 1/3 of the world's power generation, that should give everyone in the room pause and anyone on national security a big wake-up call, that China has 1/3 of the world's power generation. And the fact that of their primary energy consumption, only 20% of that is oil, means they have chosen to make 20% of that oil. And we spend a lot of time, you know, the military, like they like to war game, and there's a lot of focus on China for oil exposure, right? So during China's so-called peaceful rise in the 90s, that, you know, the thought was that they're not going to do anything because they want to grow economically and they need lots of crude oil, so they're not going to rock the boat. They're not going to go after Taiwan or anything. Well, that was kind of premised on the fact that they need a lot of oil, and that we control the sea lanes of communication, SLOCs, and our maritime, like our military control, you know, provides this security for the world. That thinking sort of works if you have massive exposure for oil. It didn't work perfectly there, but it worked at the time. And so China really leaned into that narrative. They were like, yes, we are rising peacefully. That was not necessarily true, but they leaned into that. Lots of people believed it, and we sort of kept this this facade going. And now what we're seeing is that I think you have to put a big question mark under that facade of that we were kind of all faking it, right? There's something, it's a KFAB. Somebody said this economically, and I loved it. That in fighting, like in whatever, where you're like lifting chairs and you're like beating people up, they call it KFAB, and they say basically the people that are doing fighting and the audience, everybody's in on it, right? They all know it's fake, but they kind of are in on it. And somebody was actually explaining this with the economy last year, that like we're kind of in this KFAB economy where we're all just kind of okay with everything. We know it's not quite real, but we're doing this. And we've been in this like KFAB with China for a long time, where we're like, oh, the economic growth is real and they're also peaceful and it's all working fine. Nothing is ever going to end. And so they know that's not true. We know that's not true. Everybody knows that's not true, but we just kind of fake this. And so for oil, it's really important because if 20% of their primary energy consumption is oil, it means their exposure to oil isn't as much as we think. And so from a military, if we're thinking, if we war game with them and we're thinking we'll just go after oil shipments, that's not going to work, because they're not as exposed on oil, because they've thought about this. They didn't just wake up one morning and be like, oh gosh, we're exposed, but that's fine. We just won't ever go after Taiwan. Like, no, they've been stockpiling oil for a really long time. And so do they have enough? Are they completely secure? No, they're not. But if you start thinking of Russia like we use Canada, like an overland pipeline route, that's pretty secure. No, it's not the best marriage in the world, and we can spend time talking about that. You know, is that a perfect marriage? No, it's not a perfect marriage. I've been married before. I didn't have a perfect marriage either, and it ended. But, you know, for the time, I was married. And for the time right now, Russia and China are married. So, you know, as long as they're married, as long as they're together, it's working. And you can have a lot of unhealthy relationships. People are in marriages that aren't great for a long time. That could be Russia and China and Iran and North Korea. And so Russia is sending a lot of crude oil to China. And I think you have to think of that as like, you can rail it, you can truck it, you can barge it. I'd imagine they're doing all of it. They are stockpiling way, way more crude oil than you think. So on paper, there's 17 million barrels a day demand for oil. They are not consuming 17 million barrels a day. They're consuming probably 15 million barrels a day, and they're probably stockpiling about 2 million barrels a day. Again, big alarm bells for everyone. That's something that they do, that the Chinese do, so isn't necessarily like they're going to war or they're mobilizing. It's in their nature. They like security, so that's what they're doing. But it is something to think about in terms of if you're going to war game and you're going to think outside the box. And that's why I say, I know it's hard if you're struggling with some of these things I'm saying and you're just thinking like that's too harsh. I like, you have to think in a harsh reality when you think about this stuff. You can't live in the fairy tale fictitious world of we're all going to go green and it's all going to be fine and China's actually good. That's not true. So I just start with that, and then I actually do the work to actually try to solve the problem. That's the world I live in. And so I am not a shrinking violet, and I would like to encourage the rest of the world, particularly in energy, not to be one either.
Awesome. I just wanted to close up. You have opinions that you're willing to tell people, and so what would you say? Do you have a top 2 domestic and a top 2 international, or a few recommendations you would make to the U.S. government on energy, domestic and international?
Yes, and I would say also I have one for mines and education and students
please,
as well.
yeah.
So the biggest ones for the government, and if Chris Wright calls me, or if I get a chance to work for this administration, or particularly on energy, I will. That hasn't obviously happened, or be there. But the advice would be that they do need to communicate more to the market. And I think that the thinking now so far has been, we're just going to do it. We're in the second term, it doesn't matter. But I'm also thinking that clearly there's not enough understaffing, and that's probably why it's not communicated. In energy, you do have to communicate to the market. And actually, it would probably be better for the economy, a little more communication as well. And so things are clearly getting worked out. I do believe that, so I will say, if tariffs are not about China, they damn well should be. I do think a lot of them are about China. That does have to get articulated to the market. The stock market is doing the worst coverage I've ever seen of talking about tariffs and saying, oh my gosh, it's just allies. Why are we going after allies? Mexico, the footprint of China in Mexico has quadrupled in the past 4 years. So the moment Trump put tariffs on China in 2018, they started investing heavily in Mexico. They're investing heavily in Vietnam. Our exposure to Mexico and Vietnam are massive for imports. It's all coming from China. So I am not okay with slapping a sticker that says Malaysia or Vietnam for a crappy solar panel made in Xinjiang, made with forced labor, and then sending it to the US and making everybody feel good. That's ridiculous. So we are looking at stuff like that. That, though, is not getting articulated to the market. More of this type of conversation has to happen with the market. The same for energy, right? We need to be talking about, okay, yes, Trump does want lower prices. Okay, industry, what can we take? And the industry needs to be honest. 50, it won't work. 65, it will. 60, it will. Do they love it? No. 450 gas, but there's a lot of moving parts. If we have that 450 gas, we need to make sure we have that backed up with coal. There's a lot of things, and we need to be looking at electricity prices. So I would like to hear the administration talking about electricity prices explicitly, and if you put everybody else on notice, you're cutting jobs. Why can't you put the utility companies on notice? Why can't you get utility companies to start focusing on affordability and reliability over green? I would love to see that. So that would be huge, and I think that's a quick, fast way to actually lower the actual cost of the consumer and have deflation. So those are things I'd be doing there. There's a ton on the economy, on the inflationary side that needs to be dealt with, in terms of just their red tape we have in places, like all this cutting that we're doing with Doge and stuff. It's causing some red tape. It's causing some consternation. So there are things we can streamline with the government. If you've ever dealt with the government, you know this. Those things need to be dealt with. Some simplicity, and not just cutting for the sake of cutting. So I think we need to be focused on that. I run a business. If you've ever run a business, it's we all seem to be able to balance our budget, but the government can't. So I think we need to take some practical, real world thinking and put it into government, and we do need to make it easier for people to just do business. So more of that needs to get articulated. In the oil and gas industry, so I am spending a lot of time obviously talking to folks in oil and gas and explaining, what I think is going on with Trump. I think there needs to be I'm being told that more of this, I probably need to go up to Canada and talk to them. They're freaking out. I don't think the Canadians need to quite freak out as much as they are, although I understand that they're offended, I understand that they're pissed off. But I think that you have to have conversations. And so, everybody around the world says diplomacy is amazing, but now all of a sudden they don't want diplomacy. Well, they are. They're all coming to the U.S. They're all having conversations with the administration, and it's working. So we need to continue that. The oil and gas industry needs to invest in this, right? This information. So I have to work so hard at my job because so much of it is not in the market, right? The podcast is free. So many people listen to it to get information about what's going on in the market. We did have a depression of information in oil and gas in the past 4 years, in the stock market and everything, because oil and gas companies didn't even want to talk about drilling for oil and gas. They spent so much time talking about the energy transition, so much time talking about ESG. So if you were going to the stock market to get information, well, Schlumberger wasn't talking about the macro as much. Exxon wasn't talking about the macro as much. Well, those companies in the public world set the tone for how people think about the macro view, and those didn't exist anymore. So if you want to sit here and complain about oil and gas, well, you need to start leading, right? The industry needs to lead and say, this is what we do for a living, this is why you're going to invest in us, okay? You just have to be honest about it. I think people need to stop. They need to, know what they're doing and explain it, as opposed to saying we're going to invest in wind and solar and that's not going to make money. So that's really, really important. And then, but as an industry, I mean, I can tell when I go to Midland or I go to places for SPE, and I know when the type of questions people have. I was just in Houston speaking at the Houston Producers Forum. Everyone was in there. They were dialed in. They wanted to understand geopolitics. They wanted to understand the macro. And so I feel like as an industry, we're not doing that very well. The oil and gas industry is not doing as much internally. They've kind of divested out of this. We have private equity doing some, but that gets kind of, you get some groupthink because it's just them doing it. You see that in the banks. We've seen so much divestment from the world, the Western world, out of oil and gas, that now you have the influence of Gulf countries, now you have the influence of Asia, the folks that are investing in it, and that permeates that gets into London, that gets into New York, so that gets into the market. And so you have an industry that we have to do this. And so I would like the industry to be a little more concerned about educating folks in this room and letting people like me educate you as well, and funding that, as opposed to putting a board on your door that says Baker Hughes or Halliburton or Schlumberger or ConocoPhillips or whatever it is. It seems to me like the industry has been more worried about having a tag in a building with their name on it than they have about educating the people in the room, because so many people in the room are asking me more about CO2 emissions than they are about actually what are we producing, how do we produce it, why does it matter in the system. And I'm not saying you shouldn't ask about CO2 emissions. I'm more than happy to ask that question, but I have the data and we can talk about it all day long. But it doesn't seem to me like as an industry we are educating the next generation for the complexities of everything we just spent the last hour talking about.
Awesome. Thank you so much. One thing, Trisha has an extraordinarily good podcast, so I would urge you online and in the room to listen to it. And I hope we'll next hear from you from your new office in DC. Thanks, everyone. Can we give her a
Do you have questions?
Yeah, we can't. How about questions from the room? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
or
so
I'll let you run it. Okay.
Yeah.
Clayton National Tech Corp. So after the Nord Stream pipelines got blown up, after the Russian invasion, Larry Fink of BlackRock famously said, these are just referring to the investment community, said we should have been investing in oil and gas during this time. And that's a big admission because BlackRock was famous for at least this outward appearance, so we don't invest in any kind of fossil fuels. Well, he said this out loud, and then of course Elon Musk, at the time said a similar thing. It was before Elon Musk became the Elon Musk that we know now, but that was actually part of the his evolution, I think. And then at the time, the fact that California imports about 2/3 of its oil production from foreign countries, it used to come from their oil used to come from California and Alaska. That's shrunk now. It's Ecuador, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, places like this. It seemed like for a short period of time, both public and investors, my private equity clients at the time, they said it was a lot easier to raise capital, right? Well, now they're back into, when I go to Houston and I say, hey, is it drill, baby, drill? They say, no, it's fiscal responsibility, baby, fiscal responsibility, whatever. Do you, from where you sit, after Nord Stream got blown up and it became so clear how dependent the Western world was on foreign sources, in Germany's case it was Russia, to what degree has that sentiment waned? Right, like we have a short attention span here in the West, right? And then what would it take to get people back into that mindset of like, oh yeah, California does import 2/3 of its oil from foreign sources. Oh yeah, we're still dependent on places we don't want to be dependent on. From where you sit.
It's a great question. So you're, and it brings us, I'm surprised we didn't bring up Russia more, so I'm happy to spend time talking about Russia and Ukraine. So I think there's a couple things going on there. I do hear also from the industry, same thing of, the reining in spending. That's more about oil prices than anything. That's more about, we had a decade of overspending and not making money. Then I say you had this perfect confluence of events during COVID, where you had COVID, you had all the anti-ESG, all the ESG pressure and this anti-oil sentiment. I mean, think about it. Fatih Birol during 2020 literally is on the record in his their oil outlook for saying, their world energy outlook for saying, we have responded to this crisis by saying we need to emerge from this crisis with clean energy. COVID and energy have nothing to do with each other, but they took a moment to do that. So they became politicized and they thrust it in. Well, that had a huge impact with the UN, had a huge impact with investment and everything. Russia helped the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 helped recalibrate people to realize, hey, California is importing a few 100,000 barrels a day of Russian crude oil, which is wrong from the beginning. If you're going to complain about Canadian oil sands that you hate so much, but you'll take Russian crude oil and you don't care about that's amazing to me. So we have a massive hypocrisy when it comes to actually human rights standards and especially within ESG. There's nothing ESG friendly about wind turbines or solar panels that come from China. They are not ESG friendly at all. And the same goes for this crude oil from Russia. So I think it's some of this though, right? What I just said was that you don't have information coming from the street, right? So you don't have enough oil and gas companies actually talking about what they're doing. So you have lack of information there. You don't have a lot of people like me actually out there. There are a handful that are really like talking about this. There's a few women I really respect, Sarah Vakashori, but I just heard on TV, a couple nights ago, it was late at night, it's like 11 o'clock and I'm watching the market and working out and they asked her about oil and she's like, well, it's really confusing. We just don't know right now. No, we do. Like, tell me why prices are they're $72 or almost $72 a barrel. Tell me why, what could happen with Iran. Tell me what these sanctions mean. So I think we've kind of taken this easy pass mode, and I'm not criticizing her because that could have been the moment, and she's probably very uncertain with tariffs. But we don't have enough information in the marketplace, and so this word fiscal responsibility, I think that has so much more to do with uncertainty in oil prices and uncertainty across the board. When you have uncertainty in business, you stop doing deals. That happens in oil and gas, that happens in all business. So if we have a recession or anything, you're gonna not see deals across the board. And then that uncertainty or that volatility, if we had $65 oil and things kind of settled out, you would probably see more deal making happen, right? The industry also needs to do, they spent years capitulating and leaning into what the Biden administration told them. So had they actually used their words and said what they do and stood up for what they did, maybe it would be a little easier to get money from investors. So I don't think it's gonna be hard to get money, if we pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords, this is the place that if you're gonna have capital that comes in to do business that wants oil and gas investment, and they do. We're talking about gold or oil, anything you want to hedge on inflation. Oil and gas is a place you do it. It is America, and so this administration is putting in the things to allow you to invest in oil and gas in America by permitting LNG exports, by lifting, the Paris Climate Accords, things like that. So I think the industry needs to do a better job of articulating what they're doing and why the investment thesis works. But I think the marketplace has been missing the role of oil in the now, the medium, and the long term. That's been missing in the marketplace, and I do think the oil and gas industry has a role and a blame in that because they didn't defend it, right? No one's gonna defend you unless you defend yourself, and talk about this. And so the marketplace has been missing this information. So how can I appropriately value an asset or a deal or anything if I don't have that information? And so more of this needs to be in place.
Please, your thoughts?
So
Yeah.
I have a question about the wind energy. If we compare the wind energy production in US, compare with the China is producing around 8%
Yep.
total, and they projected around 25%. But over here, we kind of at the 2%, and we are not focusing on the wind energy. What is your point of view on that one?
If you actually look at the numbers, that's not quite true. So I like your hat, your Liberty hat, by the way. Great hat. So it's really, we have of that 9,500 terawatt hours I said for China, there's 1,700 or so that are wind and solar. So they have a massive uptake. So China gets this, everybody says, oh, but China's got so much wind and solar. Well, they probably wouldn't need as much coal if they didn't put all that crappy wind and solar into their grid. But for China, they add the coal and they add the wind and solar. They're the only country in the world doing that. So they can afford the efficiencies, the redundancies, and all the crap that comes with crappy wind and solar and the intermittency because they have coal and they work together. The rest of the world, every other place in the world, takes away the baseload power and then they add the wind and solar. And so they get all the bad. They get the expensiveness, they have the intermittency, and they don't have the reliability. We are close on a terawatt hour basis for what, we're shy of it, but we've added a bunch of wind and solar into our grid. So terawatt hour basis, we're actually pretty close to China. But China, I was on the BBC right before the election, and they were like, oh, China's green. China's not green. 5,700 terawatt hours of coal-fired power generation, which is more than our entire grid. That's not green, okay? And by the way, what is green? Defining green, you cannot just call it green. If it wind turbines, which is where the onshore wind turbines, they all come from the province of Xinjiang. Xinjiang Goldwind is the number one manufacturer. The wafer from your solar panel, right? That ingot wafer comes from the province of Xinjiang. That comes from forced labor, that comes from coal-fired power generation. Look at the actual, do some Googling, do some Google Earth Googling. You can see where these facilities are in China. They're all concentrated in this area. China has worked really hard to actually bring businesses and entities up to the province of Xinjiang because they have so much coal, because they have so much labor, because they can do this. So yes, they're adding into the grid, but that's largely for energy security. That when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining in China, that just means they get to use less coal and they get to stockpile stockpile that. So, and they were able to basically, they stole the technology from Germany, then they made it, and then they dumped it on the market. And so it was sort of like what they do with cars, what they do with everything. They basically, once they dump it on the market and then they lower the cost, they raise the barrier to entry so high that you can't compete. And so I really look at energy particularly through China, for how you compete. And almost everything, energy and coal-fired power generation, it all comes back to that. How do I compete? My most basic premise of competition, we think about as inputs to lower costs. They think about as ability to just estimate competition. They're not using coal or forced labor as inputs to lower costs because they're not worried about profitability. We are. And so it's very, very hard to compete with a player that doesn't work on profitability, and we do. So it really, we have this unique game of geopolitical chess that is very, very complex.
Lovely. And I'm gonna, can I ask, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
if you have questions, I think Trisha can stick around for a little while afterwards. And can we give her another round of applause, please? It's a real pleasure to have you back on campus. Thank you for the time.
Absolutely. Happy to be back. Yeah?
We were just talking about China as well. I'd like to ask for your opinion on artisanal mining and what's going on in Africa for rare earth minerals and kind of that growing sector. It's my knowledge and kind of what I've been taught at the university as well, that China has kind of a stranglehold on some of that rare earth mineral production. And I would just like to hear your opinion on the disconnect between some of kind of bad things that come in developing green energy that maybe the Western world isn't seeing, but we're still pumping so much effort into developing despite some of what's going on the back end.
Yeah, so artisanal mining, it's a really cute term because it makes it sound like it's crafty. It's actually, those are the mines that they actually usually send children in to get to hand mine this in like the Congo and Africa. China does have the stranglehold on the footprint, the actual like mining, the upfront stuff, so the upstream side. But more importantly, they have the stranglehold on the back end of processing. So there's almost no country in the world except for China that processes these rare earth minerals or these, whether it's cobalt, whether it's lithium, all these, they process it. It's dirty, it's it's very energy intensive. You have to extract uranium and thorium from this. And so no country really wants to do that. And because China doesn't have the environmental standards, they do it. And because they have the energy and the inputs and everything. And so when you have the upstream side, that's one component of it. When you control the downstream, it makes it very difficult for anyone else to come in and compete. So now we're starting to talk about, can we produce it in the US? Well, yeah, you can produce it, but when you try to process it and you try to compete competitively in a market, then China can just change the price, right? They can just dump and they can move stuff around. And that's what we're really, in a very short answer, that's what we're really dealing with China. So we need to be thinking about the whole value chain. And really, it's even more important than just the inputs to green energy and the inputs into our phone. It's the graphite. It's the stuff that you need in the military sphere. The stuff you need just every day in your power generation in this building come from those metals and minerals as well.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, well, thanks, guys.